The cemetery was quiet that evening, as if the whole world had paused to hold its breath. The wind swayed gently through the trees, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the gravel paths. Among the gray tombstones, a small figure sat on her knees in front of a modest grave, her shoulders trembling with every silent sob. She couldn't have been more than 10, thin, pale, her black coat 2 sizes too large. Her hands, raw from the cold, clutched a weathered stuffed bunny that had clearly seen better days. A single white rose lay on the grave. Next to it, a worn photograph, her and her mother smiling under summer sun, now stained with tears. No one came to comfort her. No one even noticed. No one, except for a man standing by a jet-black Bentley at the far end of the path. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. He hadn't set foot in that cemetery for over 2 decades. Not since the funeral that changed everything. But that day, something compelled him to return. Gideon Hayes, billionaire investor, CEO of Hayes Corp, and the man Fortune magazine once called America's coldest mind, watched the little girl cry. He was a tall, commanding figure in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. People usually trembled in his presence. Boardrooms fell silent. His words moved markets. But right now, something in his chest twisted, something he hadn't felt in years. He watched her from a distance, trying to will himself to look away. But he couldn't, when she let out a soft, broken whisper. "I miss you so much, Mommy. I don't know what to do anymore." Gideon's heart clenched. That voice, that voice. For a moment, it was like he was listening to someone from his past, a voice that once called him by name, one he had silenced with greed, pride, and an unforgivable mistake. He walked toward her slowly, hesitantly, like a man approaching a ghost. She didn't hear his footsteps until he was only a few feet away. She turned startled, eyes red and cheeks blotchy. Her lips quivered, but she didn't speak. "I'm sorry," Gideon said softly. "I didn't mean to scare you." The girl looked at him puzzled. Do you know my mom?" He froze. The name on the grave read, Emily Ray Turner, beloved mother, loyal friend, 1986 to 2022. He knew that name. His heart nearly stopped. Emily. That was the name of the woman he left behind 20 years ago. He hadn't seen her since. And yet here was this child, with eyes the same hazel green, with a voice that shook him to his core, crying over her grave. I knew someone named Emily," he finally managed. "A long time ago." The girl nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "She got sick, real sick. The hospital said we couldn't afford more treatment. I tried to raise money. I even sold my toys at school. But it wasn't enough." The man's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "She was the best mom," the girl said, her voice breaking. "Even when she was hurting, she smiled. She told me stories about someone she used to love, someone who broke her heart." Gideon felt his knees weaken. What did she say about him? That he was smart, but scared. That he left because he didn't believe in love. But she never hated him. Not once. His vision blurred. The girl looked back at the grave. "Sometimes I imagine he'll come here one day. Maybe see her name and remember her. Maybe even wonder if she ever forgave him." She looked back at him. "Do you think people who leave ever regret it?" Gideon knelt beside her, slowly. His voice cracked as he said, "Every single day." There was silence. Just the wind. Just the weight of too many things unsaid. Then she whispered, "I'm Avery." And he answered, "I'm Gideon." She tilted her head. "That's funny. That was the name of the man in her stories." He could barely breathe. "Avery, how old are you?" 10, she replied. "My birthday was in November." He did the math. 10 years ago. Right around the time Emily had vanished from his life completely. Something inside him shattered. Was it possible? Could this little girl, this quiet, grieving soul, be his daughter? Avery reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small locket. "She gave this to me before she passed," she said, holding it out. "Said it used to belong to someone important." Gideon opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a faded photo of Emily. And beside her, himself, younger, happier, before he ruined everything. His breath caught. He turned pale. Tears filled his eyes for the first time in over 20 years. Avery looked up at him. "Are you okay?" He stared at her, unable to speak, a tidal wave of guilt and awe crashing down on him. "I think," he whispered, "I might have known your mother better than I realized." She smiled faintly. "She would have liked you." But Gideon didn't smile. Not yet, because the truth was only beginning to unravel, and he feared the rest of it might destroy him. He looked back at Emily's grave and whispered, "What did I do?" And that's when he noticed something else, engraved at the bottom of the headstone. "To Gideon, if you ever come back, look into her eyes and you'll see the truth I could never say." His hands trembled, because the girl wasn't just a reminder of the past, she was the secret he'd never been allowed to know. And now the entire course of his life had just been rewritten by the tears of a little girl and the grave of the woman he never stopped loving. Gideon sat in his car, staring blankly out the windshield. The black Bentley remained parked just outside the cemetery gates, engine silent, as though it too were holding its breath. His hands still trembled from the moment he read the words etched into Emily's grave. The air felt heavier now, thick with memories he had spent years burying under boardroom deals and penthouse silence. Inside him, a war raged, logic against instinct, pride against guilt, and the cold billionaire against the shattered man Emily once loved. Avery had gone home. She'd smiled at him before she left, holding the locket tight. She didn't know who he really was. Not yet. All she said was, "Maybe we'll see each other again. You're nice." Nice. That single word hit him harder than any business loss. He had no idea where she lived, who took care of her now, or what her life had become since Emily died. But something in her eyes haunted him, an emptiness far too familiar. He couldn't walk away. Not again. That night he made a call. "Ruth," he said as his longtime assistant answered, "I need everything you can find on a girl named Avery Turner, age 10. Her mother was Emily Turner, passed away last year in Chicago." There was a pause. "You said you never wanted that name spoken again," Ruth replied cautiously. "I was wrong." Another silence, softer this time. Then a quiet, "Understood." By morning, Gideon had answers. Avery lived in the city's west side, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a struggling bakery. She wasn't with any living relatives. After Emily's death, a neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, an elderly widow, had taken the girl in informally, avoiding the system out of fear Avery would be lost in it. Mrs. Delgado survived on Social Security and tips from knitting commissions. Avery walked 3 miles to school every day. Sometimes she skipped meals to save food for her guardian. Sometimes she cried herself to sleep. And worst of all, no one knew who Avery's father was. Emily had left that line blank on every document. Gideon closed the file and leaned back in his chair. His Manhattan office, usually a place of sharp control, now felt suffocating. He remembered Emily at 20, spirited, artistic, brilliant. She wanted to paint the world. He wanted to own it. He had broken her heart when he told her he had no time for love, that he couldn't let her distract him from real success. He had told himself he was doing her a favor, freeing her from a life of emotional instability. But now, all he saw was a woman who suffered quietly, alone, and a daughter left behind to pick up the pieces of his cowardice. He booked a flight that night. The next morning, Gideon stood on the steps of the little brick bakery on Avery's block. It was modest, with paint peeling from the awning and the smell of yeast and sugar drifting faintly through the air. Children laughed a block away. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes tinkled against the cold breeze. He knocked gently on the apartment door. A minute later, it creaked open. Avery's eyes widened. "You came—" Mrs. Delgado appeared behind her, eyes narrowing protectively. "Can I help you, sir?" I met Avery at the cemetery," Gideon explained. "My name is Gideon Hayes." Mrs. Delgado's expression didn't change. "You're the one from the grave." Gideon nodded. "I need to talk to you. About Emily. About Avery." Reluctantly, she let him in. The apartment was warm but cramped. Faded photographs lined the walls. A pot of soup bubbled gently on the stove. "You said you knew Emily," Mrs. Delgado began cautiously as she poured him tea. "How?" Gideon glanced at Avery, who sat silently at the kitchen table, coloring a page with worn crayons. "I loved her," he said quietly, "and I failed her." Mrs. Delgado studied him for a long time. "You left her, didn't you?" He swallowed hard. "Yes," she sighed, shaking her head. "Emily never said a bad word about you, not once, even when she was dying." "I didn't know she was sick," he said, his voice cracking. "You didn't know you had a daughter either, did you?" He turned to Avery. She was watching him now, not frightened, just curious. "No," he admitted. "But now that I do, I want to do something. Anything. She deserves more than this." Mrs. Delgado raised an eyebrow. "You think you can waltz in here with your suit and your guilt and fix a lifetime of pain?" "No," Gideon said softly, "but I can start." He pulled out a folder, legal papers, offers of guardianship, housing, education funds. Every page was a desperate attempt to make things right. "I want to help. I want her to live in a place where she can be safe, go to school, eat, smile." "And what about love?" Mrs. Delgado challenged. "You think a fancy apartment can replace that?" Gideon looked at Avery again. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'd like the chance to try." Avery rose from the table slowly, clutching her coloring page. She walked over, handed it to him. On the paper was a crude drawing of a man and a girl standing beside a gravestone. The man had tears on his face. Underneath, in shaky letters, it said, "Maybe he came back." Gideon's chest tightened. He dropped to one knee, eye level with her. "Would it be okay," he asked, "if I came back again tomorrow?" Avery thought for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." Mrs. Delgado said nothing, but her silence wasn't rejection. That night, for the first time in years, Gideon couldn't sleep, because for the first time in years, someone small and fragile had looked at him with hope, and he didn't want to break it. Not again. Not this time. The next morning, Gideon arrived with no entourage, no suit, no limousine, just a cup of cocoa in one hand and a bundle of sketchbooks in the other. He wore a worn leather jacket and jeans that hadn't seen daylight since before he made his first million. He looked like a man trying to remember who he used to be. Avery was waiting at the window, chin resting on her arms. When she saw him, she smiled, and something in Gideon's chest softened, like thawing ice. Mrs. Delgado opened the door before he even knocked. "She's been up since dawn," she said dryly. "Wouldn't touch breakfast. Said she was saving her appetite for Billionaire cocoa." He chuckled, surprised by the warmth in the older woman's voice. Inside, Avery immediately hugged him. Something small, quick, but real. Gideon wasn't used to being touched with affection. Not anymore. But he knelt and wrapped his arms around her gently, as though afraid she might vanish like a dream. They sat on the floor with the sketchbooks. Avery began drawing. Gideon watched her, amazed by her quiet focus. She didn't speak much, but the pictures told stories. Stories of a mother and daughter, of rainy days spent painting, of bedtime lullabies and soup when she was sick. There was one picture of a hospital room, a woman in bed, tubes in her arms, Avery by her side, holding her hand. He couldn't stop staring at that one. "Was that the last time you saw her?" he asked softly. Avery nodded. "She told me not to cry when she left, but I cried anyway." A silence fell between them. Then she added, "She told me someone would come, someone she loved once, that he would fix the broken parts." Gideon looked at her, tears welling again. "She meant you," Avery whispered. His voice cracked. "I didn't know, sweetheart. If I had—" "She knew you didn't know," Mrs. Delgado interjected from the kitchen. "Emily wrote you letters, but she never sent them. Said she couldn't bring herself to. Said it would hurt too much if you didn't answer." Gideon turned slowly. "Letters?" Mrs. Delgado nodded and reached for a small wooden box under the counter. "I didn't know if I should show you these, but Avery has a right to know who her mother was. And you need to see what she carried all those years." Inside the box were over a dozen envelopes, some addressed, most not, all in the same looping handwriting Gideon had tried to forget for 20 years. He opened the first one. Dear Gideon, I saw your face in the paper today. You looked colder than I remember. Harder. I wondered if you ever thought about me. About us? You probably don't. I never told you, but I was pregnant when you left. I was scared. I thought maybe you'd come back. That you'd say it was a mistake and you'd want us. But months passed, and then years. I named her Avery. She has your eyes. Gideon's hands shook as he read. Each letter was a piece of her pain, preserved like pressed flowers, fragile, but hauntingly beautiful. Letters she never had the courage to send because she feared being forgotten. He read them all, one by one. By the end, he was sobbing. Avery climbed into his lap and held his hand. It's okay, she whispered. I miss her too. He clutched her, swearing silently to the ghost of Emily that he would never let her daughter feel alone again. That night, he invited both Avery and Mrs. Delgado to dinner at his penthouse. They hesitated. The old woman didn't trust luxury, and Avery had never even been in an elevator before. But they came. The dining room was awkwardly formal. Crystal, candles, polished mahogany. Gideon realized halfway through the meal that Avery was pushing peas around her plate, intimidated. Without thinking, he stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a tray of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Emily's favorite comfort meal. Avery's face lit up. Mrs. Delgado smiled, just a little. Something shifted that night. A new rhythm formed. Gideon began visiting daily. He helped with homework, told stories, taught Avery to play chess. She taught him to draw badly. They laughed more than he had in years. And slowly, Mrs. Delgado began to trust him, not as a billionaire, but as a man. One evening, as Avery slept, the two adults sat in the kitchen sipping tea. She's happy, Mrs. Delgado said softly. I haven't seen her this alive since, well, since before. Gideon nodded. I don't want to take her away. I want you to stay in her life. I want her to have more. She deserves everything. Mrs. Delgado studied him carefully. You know she doesn't need your money, right? I know, he said, but she needs love. And that, I have to earn. Just as the words left his mouth, a knock echoed from the front door. Mrs. Delgado frowned. Who the hell? She opened the door. Two suited men stood outside. One held a clipboard. The other wore a cold smirk. Good evening. We're from Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous report about an unauthorized guardian arrangement. Mrs. Delgado's face drained of color. Behind them, a black car idled. Avery stirred awake in the other room. Gideon stepped forward, towering over them. You're not taking her anywhere, he said darkly. Sir, one of the men replied, you don't have legal custody either, unless you'd like to discuss that downtown. Avery appeared in the hallway, eyes wide with fear. Mr. Gideon, she whispered. He turned to her, then back to the agents. Give us a moment. Inside, he dropped to one knee. Sweetheart, do you trust me? She nodded slowly. I promise you, no matter what happens tonight, I'm going to fix this. You're not going to lose your home again. She looked at him, eyes glistening. Promise? Cross my heart, he said, placing a hand over his chest. Then he turned to the door, fury simmering just beneath his skin, because someone had tried to erase what he had just begun to build. And Gideon Hayes didn't let anyone take what he loved. Not anymore. Gideon Hayes had built an empire with steel nerves, brilliant instincts, and an ability to tear down anyone who stood in his way. But tonight, standing between a terrified little girl and two CPS agents with polished shoes and cold eyes, he had never felt more helpless or more furious. The moment they stepped inside, Avery clung to him like a lifeline. Mrs. Delgado demanded a warrant, but they brushed her off, claiming a routine welfare check. A neighbor had anonymously reported an unstable living arrangement for a minor, citing an unverified male presence. Gideon, his jaw clenched. Someone had gone out of their way to sabotage him. Avery's wide eyes pleaded with him silently. He made a choice. I'm calling my lawyer, Gideon said firmly, pulling out his phone. One of the agents tried to protest, but it was too late. Within minutes, Ruth, his assistant, patched him through to a full legal team on speakerphone. The agent's smug expressions began to fade as the names of powerful law firms were dropped like bombs into the tiny living room. Mrs. Delgado looked from him to Avery, then back. "What is happening?" "I don't know who tipped them off," Gideon said, keeping his voice steady, "but they clearly underestimated me." The next few hours were chaos. Calls, paperwork, escalations. The CPS team, now clearly nervous, left with a warning. The situation would be reviewed by the court within 72 hours. Avery could stay, but only under strict observation. As their car disappeared down the street, Mrs. Delgado closed the door and whispered, "I bet it was her sister." "Who?" Gideon asked. "Emily's sister. Marlene." Gideon blinked. "Emily had a sister?" "She never talked about her much," the older woman said with a bitter edge. "Marlene's the opposite of Emily. Greedy, vindictive. When Emily died, she showed up out of nowhere, demanding custody of Avery. But she didn't want the girl. She wanted her apartment and whatever life insurance money was left. When she found out there wasn't much, she disappeared again." Gideon's stomach twisted. "Why would she do this now?" Mrs. Delgado looked at him pointedly. "Because Avery's name is back in the news. You're in the news." He understood. His presence, the mysterious billionaire showing up in a poor girl's life, had drawn attention, and someone, somewhere, had sensed opportunity. He wouldn't let that happen. That night, Gideon didn't return to his penthouse. He stayed on a pull-out couch in Mrs. Delgado's spare room. Avery slept curled beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his pinky, as if afraid he might vanish. By morning, he had a plan. It was time to stop hiding. He called Ruth. "Set the press conference." "You're serious?" she asked. "Yes. I'm done keeping this private." The conference was held 2 days later on the marble steps of Hayes Corp headquarters. Dozens of reporters gathered, curious about the sudden announcement from the famously reclusive CEO. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed. Gideon stood tall, eyes blazing. "I've made my fortune by keeping my personal life separate from my business. But today, that ends." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 10 years ago, I made a mistake that changed the course of 2 lives, one of whom I never even knew existed. Until last week. Her name is Avery Turner." Gasps. Photographers scrambled. "She is my daughter. Her mother, Emily Turner, was the love of my life, and I left her behind, foolishly, arrogantly, believing I could outrun what my heart wanted." His voice broke, just slightly. "But love always finds a way back, and so does truth." The media went wild. Questions were shouted. Rumors exploded across headlines. "Billionaire CEO claims surprise daughter." "Who is Avery Turner?" "Hayes Corp heiress found?" But the moment Gideon returned to the small apartment that night, none of that mattered. Avery ran to him with a hug. "They talked about me at school," she said shyly. "Some kid said I was going to be rich." He knelt beside her. "You'll be loved. That's what matters." She grinned. "Can I still go to school with my friends?" "You can go wherever you want," he promised. Then came the final blow. The next morning, Marlene showed up. She stormed into the bakery like a thundercloud in heels, clutching a stack of papers. "I'm taking custody," she snapped, waving the documents. "You don't get to sweep in and play daddy now. Emily was my sister." "You never cared about Emily," Mrs. Delgado spat. "I care about what's fair," Marlene hissed. "And legally, I have blood rights." Gideon stood slowly. "Marlene," he said calmly, "you're not here for Avery. You're here for attention and money." "You think the courts care about your feelings?" she sneered. "You're not even on the birth certificate." Gideon smiled coldly. "True, but I'm also the most powerful man in this city, and I've already filed for emergency custody. I've offered you a settlement to walk away. Generous considering your behavior." She looked stunned. "You can't buy your way out of this." "No," he said, "but I can show them that you've been investigated for financial fraud 3 times in the last decade, that your landlord's threatening eviction, and that you've never spent more than 10 minutes alone with Avery in her life." Her face went white. "You wouldn't." "I already did," he replied. Marlene stormed out. The next week, a judge granted Gideon full legal guardianship. Mrs. Delgado was named co-guardian. Avery got a new home, A warm bedroom with skylights, art supplies, books. Her own key to the garden? But more than that, she got a father who showed up every day, who made pancakes badly, who let her braid his hair while he read emails, who told her about her mother every night before bed. The town was shocked. They couldn't believe the cold billionaire had fallen apart for a little girl with sad eyes and a quiet voice. But the truth? He hadn't fallen apart. He had been rebuilt from the pieces Emily left behind, and the girl who cried at her mother's grave had given a broken man a reason to live again.